Feminist Literary Theory, Without Grace, a novel by Carol Honig. So, a summary about the story. It's in the point of view of a young small-town woman named Vicky Finley. She, at a young age, she lost her grandmother to death and her mother. So her mother had run away from the family when Vicky was very, very young, so she has no memory of her mother. She aspires to be a chef in Montreal, as well as to find her mother. And then, with the death of her grandmother and her mother leaving, Vicky is left to care for her house of men, which includes her father, her grandfather, and her brother. Feminism in the 1960s. So for the first few years, women were viewed as happy housewives and mothers. The females didn't really expect a lot from life. So as this quote says, the female doesn't really expect a lot from life. She's here as someone's keeper, her husband's, or her children's. So I think this quote just signifies the fact that women didn't really expect to care for themselves as much as to care for the people that were in their house. The feminist movement focused on dismantling workplace inequality, and some progress was made from that movement, females now being allowed into the workforce. However, many still considered the roles of women to be housewives or mothers. The male roles in the story. So as I mentioned before, there were three prominent males in the story: the father, Kevin, and the grandfather. So the father's role in the house was king of the house. He was a very hard worker as well as the breadwinner in the family. So the quote I chose to defend this point was when Vicky said, "That would give me enough time since there was a pan of lasagna thawing for Dad and Grandpa." So typically the woman role was to care for the men in the house as well as mainly to care for the hardworking men in the house. So this quote shows that Vicky was making sure that her father and her grandfather had food every night. Kevin, who is Vicky's older brother, was looked at as her hero and her defender, as well as just a guidance figure. He gave a lot of strong points to her and helped her throughout the novel. So the quote I chose was from a scene in the novel where Brad was harassing Vicky and Kevin had shown up out of nowhere, and this was from Vicky's point of view, where she said, "I moved out of the glare and saw Kevin's fist connecting with Brad's nose over and over again." So this quote kind of signifies that Kevin had always been there to defend Vicky, being her older brother, even though at the time they were not talking to each other. And then the grandfather, he, in the story, is kind of quiet because of the loss of his wife, but he is very, very wise. And the quote I chose to defend this point was that he took my hands in his face and said, "Because someone in this house has got to keep on living, Vicky. I'm so goddamn tired of how stale everything is anymore." So he was saying that someone's got to stand up and be happy. The roles of women in the story. So I chose the two women that I thought stood out. So Vicky, obviously the main character, was looked at as the housewife. She was expected to cook and clean for the men of the house, as well as she was looked at throughout the story as a sex object, constantly getting unwanted comments by different males in the story. And then one of the quotes I took was from Brad, who had said, "He put a smirking, clammy face in mine. How about riding me, baby?" So this quote just shows how dirty the men in this story were towards Vicky, who was still a young woman at the time. And then the grandmother, who before she died had a motherly role because Vicky's mother was not there, so she was looked at as the caregiver. And I chose a quote of the day before Vicky's first day of school, where the grandmother had said, "Now these are your school clothes," she said. "I won't have you looking like little orphan Annie to give people more to talk about. Come on, let's get you in the tub." Vicky's attitude towards the male characters. So she did look at them as if they had more authority over her, and they were not responsible for the housework. She constantly made sure, she cleaned up after them and made sure that she cooked for them. So the male characters in her house were breadwinners, taking care of the farm while she cooked dinner and kept the house clean. She also, I feel, felt very submissive and vulnerable towards the different males in the story. More vulnerable to Brad and the men throughout the story who had harassed her with their sexual comments. And then submissive as well as responsible for housework. I chose a quote to support that, which was, "With a mouth full of potatoes," Dad said, "you're going to have time to cook like this with that job of yours." I took this quote as him not wanting Vicky to have a job because he didn't think she was going to have time to do the housework that they expected her to do. So my conclusion for this presentation is that although the typical feminist gender roles are prominent in the novel Without Grace, Vicky follows them, yet she still works to break out of the typical roles, eventually moving away to Montreal and getting a job for herself, so leaving her family and her typical housewife role.